our announcements. And next to me is sitting Danah Boyd. Danah is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley's School of Information. She is currently a graduate fellow at the USC Annenberg Center, and she's also a social media researcher at Yahoo Research Berkeley. Her recent work has explored topics like such as the creation of digital publics in myspace.com, the design of culturally adaptive software, and even the exploration of folksonomy. She keeps a blog at www.zephoria.org/thoughts, which is a great blog. And I will keep this short, and I'll let Danah say a couple words about how she got here and what she'll be talking about today. We'll have an interesting format. It'll be a little bit of an open format, and we'll be taking questions from the crowd. So no further ado.
Thank you, Brad. So good afternoon. I am shocked to see so many people. It's quite exciting. So thank you. I actually sprung this on Fred a matter of a few days ago. I was like, so I'm coming to Chapel Hill. Is there any use that you might have of me since I'm here for an extra day? And he's like, oh, come talk. So as a result, I didn't actually prepare a formal talk, but I decided that it would be fun to sort of create a conversation. In many ways, ooh, you're ringing. In many ways, like I'm attending a very small information school, and so one of the things I'm in awe of here is that you guys have a really big one that actually has a lot of librarian history, which is fascinating to me. So I think I should start by saying, who am I? How did I get here? So I was 13 years old when my brother got online, and I thought it was the dumbest thing in the world, and I didn't understand why he was spending so much time on his computer. And then I realized he was talking to people. And I was like, ooh. And so I used to sneak in and talk to people on his computer. And then my brother and I managed to ring up a $700 phone bill. My mother's like, what the hell are you two doing? We're like, nothing. And from that point on, we decided to sneak into the local college and figure out ways to actually play with what we saw online. And my high school years were spent with the sort of open-eyed amazement of what it meant to actually talk to people who didn't grow up in rural Pennsylvania, who had totally different perspectives on the world, complete strangers, and I'm sure if my mother had any clue what I was doing back then, she would be terrified like most parents are now. But it was an amazing thing for me, and part of what I found out during that era was about colleges that were not Penn State, and I was like, I want to go to one of them. So I decided to go to Brown University, where I decided I would study computer science and build the kinds of systems that I saw, being a part of my childhood and was so excited about. So I got into computer graphics, and I started building 3D systems and realized I hated 3D with a passion. And somewhere along the lines, I met a woman named Judith Donath at MIT, and she was like, oh, come visualize some of these email lists that I'm working on. I was like, ooh, visualization, social stuff, it'd be really cool. So I ended up going to MIT for grad school take one. And what I was doing there is I was visualizing social behavior online. And I was getting more and more back into my high school years. And I created a project called Social Network Fragments, which was meant to be a complaint against a lot of privacy issues and sort of revelations around privacy. What I did was I took people's email spools and I visualized the social networks of the people you know. So the fact of the matter is that from your email spool, you don't just know who you know, but you actually know a lot about who your friends know. And through CCs, through BCCs, through who you talk about in those messages. And I created a set of visualizations that I put up as an art exhibit, which is the way you get out of human subjects requirements. And I put it up in a gallery in New York with a bunch of people's email spools, and people walked in and saw their names on the screen and flipped out, which was great. It was quite fun. And the Department of Defense said, come work with me, and I went, no, most certainly not. And I went running away. And I dropped out of grad school for a variety of different reasons following 9/11, and was running around the country misbehaving. And my undergrad advisor tracked me down, and he was like, oh, you need to go back to school. What are you doing? And I'm like, ignoring him. He's like, I'm moving to San Francisco. I don't care what you say. He's like, well, I know someone in San Francisco. And I was like, whatever. Next day I get a phone call. He's like, you have appointments in San Francisco in 10 days. Get there. I'm like, ooh, I'm in trouble. And I show up, and I met a man named Peter Lyman, who is at the iSchool. Some of you may know him. And we kind of kicked it off right away, and we decided that we would cause trouble together. I had no idea what an iSchool was. My image of librarianism was a little problematic, shall we say. I had been kicked out of a library in the 6th grade and hadn't been back to one since, including the entire way through my undergrad and graduate career. So the idea that I was going to a library school was quite entertaining. And at the same time, there was a site launched called Friendster.com. And so I'm still not in grad school, not supposed to be doing research, and I start futzing around with Friendster starting in December of 2002. And mind you, I started a blog in 1997. I'd been writing random things that I felt like for forever. So I started actually writing about Friendster, what I was observing, what I was hearing in cafes in San Francisco and New York, just following all of the little gossip trails, totally fascinated by the social networks aspect of it. In the meantime, people started actually sending me data, which, you know, of course it wasn't data then, because it was just like, ooh, funny thoughts. And at some point, Peter looked at me and goes, how much data do you have on Friendster? I'm like, I don't know. And I figured out that I had over 10,000 messages, had documented 2,000 different, you know, different press bits of it, and had scraped most of the site. So he was like, you might actually want to do something with that. So I actually turned it into my first research project, and then again realized I didn't have any human subjects permission. So stopped that research, decided I would start up and start studying, and mind you, a lot of people have read various things I've written on Friendster, mostly in public space, and very little in academic publications because of permissions to do anything. So I started actually studying blogging, and my goal in studying blogging was to run away from the social network space and to look at what teens were doing. And my advisor got a grant, sort of part of a big grant project for the MacArthur Foundation to look at youth. And I thought I would study blogging. And I started following youth as they went from blogging to MySpace. And sure enough, I ended up back in the middle of the social network space. Of course, very funnily, I had actually been collecting data on MySpace as well since the beginning of its launch. And I made a deal with my advisor that I would not talk at all publicly about MySpace. I would behave, and I would not mess with the data set at all. And so the idea was, the concern was that I actually affected the growth of Friendster. So I was like, I'll be quiet. So I didn't write a single thing on my blog, and then Murdoch bought MySpace, and I went, can I talk about it now? He's like, yeah, you can't possibly affect anything that's going on. I'm like, yes. Oops. So MySpace, I wrote an essay, sort of my first essay, which was for American Association of the Advancement of Science, was sort of a talk that I gave there about the first wave of research I'd been doing on digital kids. And it happened just at the same time as the predator panic began, the moral panic began. And unfortunately, I've ended up right back in the middle of things. So we'll sort of see what that means. But I want to sort of tell you what I'm looking at with MySpace. In many ways, I tell the public I'm talking about MySpace, but that's actually only a fraction of what my dissertation is about. Since we're actually more of an academic audience, it's sort of like, I can tell you this and you won't be terrified. Most people look at me like, I'm interested in actually the status of youth and the shifts in public life for youth. So the concept of a teenager was actually invented by the marketing industry, but it came in a period where during the Depression, the labor movement decided that they couldn't afford to have the 14 to 17-year-olds in the workforce. So compulsory education came about during that period as a way to regulate that population into a controlled environment. One of the things that we did as sort of a gift was make it an all-encompassing high school experience. And part of it was that sports were a really big thing during the war as a way of getting people's minds off of what was going on and all of the political environments, to sort of work out negative energy. But it was a main thing that you would do within your labor community. So you would, your company or your factory would sort of team up against another factory, and it was a real bonding experience. In order to keep those team populations out of that as well, they created high school components of it. So you had this shift that happened in the 1930s where we started actually really closing down and encircling that teenage population, what we now call teenagers, young adults, when young adult actually meant something. And we sort of gave them a place, to become their own together. And there were a lot of other components to it, religious views and ideas that it would be for the health and growth of these children. In the 1950s, following the war, we had a lot of guilt about this, and we actually gave them a lot of expendable money. We created a lot of places for them to go hang out with, their own public spaces, movie theaters that were very targeted at teens, burger joints that had very particular teen constructs and were very supported, bowling alleys with teen nights, roller rinks, etc., etc. The nice things that you see 1950s movies made of. That community ended up, or that teen population ended up creating its own identity, brought on in many ways by consumerism, until the 1960s, when they decided to misbehave, and people decided they didn't like actually what teenagers were doing when they were left to their own devices. Following pretty much the Vietnam period, we started creating more and more regulations around what that population could do. So we gave them freedom to vote, but we also started restricting their access to a lot of things. Curfew laws came into being, ideas of when they could go, when they could work, what they could do, really sort of clamped down. Today, you know, when I go and talk to parents, I deal with parents who can't remember a time where their kid was out of their sight. Except when they're at school or a controlled activity. They go from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. in a constant state of activity, a constant controlled space. The more those kids are controlled in middle class society, the more they react out with a lot of what we consider dangerous behaviors: anorexia, bulimia, cutting. Extreme sports being the positive version of it, extreme sex being the not so positive version. What is this reaction? What is going on? What has changed in their public life? And why are they jumping on MySpace? One of the things that I found looking at it was they're recreating a public world. They're creating a public online so they can go and do what most of us did growing up. Bike around the neighborhood, hang out, shoot the shit, do nothing, right? Like just socialize with their friends. And of course, from an adult perspective, it's like, this is a waste of time. But actually, it's a very critical informal learning period because it's how you figure out how the social world works. It's how you figure out status. It's how you negotiate community. It's how you get cultural understanding. And so they've already, like this population in America has already been so contained by age-based segregation. It's really interesting that they're even more contained now than even when I grew up, and now they're moving it to online to try to have a hangout space. Needless to say, what teenagers do when they hang out is not always approved by adults. We tend to model ourselves 4 years ahead. 17 magazine is bought by 13-year-olds. We start reaching a level of hypersexuality in our performance by the high school years, sometimes by the middle school years, by looking up to what our notions of celebrity and our ideals are. So what is it that's creating this culture of MySpace is in many ways mass media culture. It's not, it's this relationship between mass media, between celebrity. The challenge of sites like MySpace is, of course, they have properties of mediated communities that are very different than properties of the physical publics that we're used to. Persistence, searchability, replicability, and invisible audiences. These 4 properties are pretty funny because it means that in order to have asynchronous communication, you have to have persistence. Persistence means that people actually have access to this when they're not around, so it doesn't have that ephemerality. You're not, the conversation sort of spreads and is visible in context that you're not expecting. Searchability. My mom would have loved the ability to magically scream into the air, "Grep danah," and have me appear and know exactly where I was. That didn't happen, thank goodness. But what does it mean that in the publics that these teens hang out with, their parents can magically search for them and not even make that search visible? Replicability. I have a conversation with Fred. We sit on IM. I decide I'm annoyed with Fred. I can publish it to the world. And how do you tell the difference between the original and the copy? Right? Classic conversation around digital bits. Finally, invisible audiences. I have a sense of who's staring at me right now. It's kind of a little weird. It's like, and I can see people nodding or just kind of making scraggly faces and balance what I'm saying accordingly, or do a terrible job at it. But I have that sense of who can overhear me. I also have to deal with the fact that there's this blinking red light over there that's letting me know that there are many audiences hearing what I'm saying that I don't know about. But that's a world of mediated communication, is that we deal with invisible audiences that we can't see who are reacting to us and we don't know. And there's a lot of experience with this, but it's not the experience that everyday people have growing up. My favorite example that I love to give is Joshua Myers' work on No Sense of Place is fantastic, for those who haven't read it. It's about television and a lot of the changes that happened with mediated worlds. And he gives a great example from the 1960s of Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael is, especially sitting around Berkeley, a very well-known man for his work in the Black Power movement. And he was, at the time, giving regular speeches, in the early 1960s, giving regular speeches to white politicos using a very proper, educated vernacular, very posh way of speaking. At the same time, he was going and speaking in Southern black congregations using a style that's sort of more recognized as a rolling pastoral style, very much an engaging style, that at the time was terrifying to white society. In 1968, he was forced to go on television, and he had to make a choice. There was no neutral voice, no way that he could be simultaneously accepted by white society and by his own people in the black community. And he chose to not turn his back on his people. The result is, to this day, we see black power as very anti-white, and it comes from this mediated version of what black power was. And so I look at what teenagers are doing, and it has a very similar narrative. They're trying to figure out how to be cool to their friends and deal with all of the adults and administrators and people that are looking in on them. And there's no really good way to do that, right? Like, that's why you get called a brown noser. That's why you get, labeled all these things when you try to look like a goody two-shoes to, to adults. So these kids are dealing with this really complex relationship. And I had this amazing conversation with an Ivy League admissions officer. And I had accepted a young man from downtown Los Angeles, and a kid who was a part of gang culture in LA. And he'd written this beautiful essay about how he grew up in gang culture and wanted to get out of it. And then they went to his MySpace, and it was filled with gang imagery. And they were like, is he lying to us? This is terrible. We can't accept a gang member. This is awful. And I said, no, he's got to live where he's living in Los Angeles and survive to get to your school. You have to remember that you're reading this in the context of him and his everyday peers. Because that's a critical thing to realize about both Facebook and MySpace. Facebook, you probably obviously know. That these are representations of the people that you know. These are not making friends with a bazillion strangers. So a lot of it is very deeply rooted in the norms of the physical world in which this population grows up in. And I'm going to pause and say, are there any questions? Because I do want this to be more of a conversation than me babbling, which I can do forever, which is scary.
So do you see the physicality role that they have as being almost diametrically opposed to what they end up trying to display elsewhere?
So the question is, do I see the physicality as diametrically opposed to what they're trying to display elsewhere? I think the physical, there's a couple of different ways to look at that. First, there's the embodiment issue. In many ways, the physicality of the body is this really interesting thing because we use it as a performative object, right? I wear silly things that gets me stared at in a place like North Carolina. But, and part of it sort of tells something about who I am, where I come from culturally. I use this as a performative marker of saying who I am. Some of which I do, very much through fashion. Some of which I do because it's written on my body. I'm not very good at trying to be a guy. Tried, it doesn't really work, I don't pass. So there's these measures. One is the interesting thing about what it means to create a digital body, to create a representation of self. So that's one aspect of the physicality. Another aspect is what it means to have a community. So we're pretty used to the notion of writing yourself into being online. This is something referenced Jenny Sundin, Material Virtuality. It's a really fantastic book. What it means to write yourself into being, which is old Usenet and up through, in many ways, phase one of web culture. One of the things that's really unique about social networks is that you're writing your community into being. And that's a really interesting thing because who is your community? It's an egocentric community, and it's an ego-centered community of the people in your physical world because these are the people that actually have power over you in some interesting social way. They are the ones who validate you. They are the ones who say, sort of if you're accepted or not in that social space. And that way it's very directly related. There are exceptions, right? Being that marginalized freak kid in Pennsylvania, I loved meeting strangers. It was great. It was freeing. And for most queer kids today, they really don't want to hang out with their friends from school online. But one of the things that's very unique about MySpace is that it is mainstream culture. It is really a representation of that physical community. What that means is all sorts of good and all sorts of bad. You can fully see the models of a school. I've been actually mapping out the models of downtown Los Angeles schools, and one of the things, both good and bad, you can figure out who gets to go to what summer camps together. You get to figure out who plays softball together. You also get to see very, very clearly the racial tensions of every school in Los Angeles, which are extreme and they pretend like they don't exist. For those who aren't aware of Los Angeles situations, their schools regularly close at least 2 to 3 times a year for racially based gang violence, and there are murders on campus on a regular basis. And sure enough, it's fully modeled in my space. So you can actually see the dynamics and you can see the physical tensions that are going on. And this is particularly true of teenagers. It actually tends to devolve as you get older. It's true through college. So Facebook actually has the exact same physical social structure dynamics. It's kind of starts to change around 25 when you can watch as people desperately seek sex. And the funny thing about sex is you kind of want to meet people you don't know. So the result is that you're actually really willing to break free of the social boundaries of the physical space. But so those aspects of physicality still get played out. The interesting thing of adults coming in is that the first thing that they try to do is search. Teenagers don't actually spend all their days searching. That's what they do when they're bored. They actually go and hop around to their friends' pages. If you try to search for sex online, I can promise you, you can find it. Guaranteed, hands down, no question. I think it's here, actually, that there was some research that came out that people do more searching for religion than sex, though. I don't know if somebody knows that. I saw this somewhere flying through my spool of papers I'm supposed to read. But what ends up happening, kids there are not actually looking for sex. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are exceptions to everything. We're talking about 100 million accounts. 14-year-old boys have an amazing desire to go and track down porn queens. It doesn't really surprise me, since that's also the population that likes to, surreptitiously collect Playboys. And so you will inevitably see a 14-year-old boy have their top 8 filled with these very, blonde, what I'm having fun finding out is really does exist if you live in Los Angeles. This very classic image of, oh, dear me. So the airbrushed collection of women, they do collect them. It is pretty impressive, but that's not the majority of behavior, and you get sick of that shortly thereafter because you realize that the blonde, busty women are not going to actually respond to you. But if they do write a comment, who do you get cred to your friends? And in that way, it becomes actually right back to the physical space because it's all about getting cred to your friends. So you desperately want a band to comment on your page, especially if it's a cool band, or a famous celebrity, or a busty model. Does that help answer what you're asking? All right. Mm-hmm.
Could you go back to moral panic for a minute and what
Sure.
is going on there?
The moral panic. It's interesting. Predators online have been the moral panic consistently since the web got created. My favorite last round of it was in 2000, where, of course, we went through all the chat rooms and whatnot. Barry Glassner, Culture of Fear, does an amazing job of documenting the full details of that. Moral panic, occurs and has always occurred around teenagers when we are afraid of what risks might come into being, where they may actually get themselves into danger. Moral panics, of course, are much broader than that. Cohen is, again, good reference on that one. The thing that happens with MySpace, there are kids doing risky behavior online. So another angle of the things that I used to do, I worked for 5 years creating all the digital communities and all the digital world around a nonprofit called V-Day. For any of you who happen to have seen the Vagina Monologues, that's V-Day. And so working with 2,500 organizers around the world who were trying to end violence against women and girls, I've unfortunately got to see some of the worst of what happens. 4-year-old girls raped, really not okay. So I have a deep appreciation for the fear. And the question is, where and when does it happen online? What's actually going on? Because one of the dangers that we have is that we take this fear, the possibility, the Dateline shows, and we magnify it to this extreme where it's going to happen to anyone. Unfortunately, there are situations that put people more at risk than others. Most of the teens who get themselves into trouble and seek out attention of older men, noticeably older men, are not in good shape. Unfortunately, it's been very correlated with familial abuse. For anybody who's worked in this area knows that, unfortunately, too commonly. There are a group of middle-class kids, and it is almost all middle-class white girls who desperately decide they're going to create risks, and they often portray themselves as 18 years old, even though they're like 14, 15, and they pretend they're a college freshman at whatever the local college is, and they try to seek out the attention of the juniors and seniors at that college. Unfortunately, this actually models directly to physical behaviors where my peer group thought it was a really fun thing to go to frat parties. Again, not so bright. And it's a level of seeking risk. But that's usually not what we talk about with the predators, but it's important to know that that exists. The question of the predators is, who are they? How are they actually reaching out and trying to get at kids? Interestingly enough, there's some, I've read way too many books about the psychology of predators. I don't really recommend it. It's kind of painful. But one of the things that they will reveal who they are before meeting teens, and that has been consistently true for any case that we've seen on any online space, not just MySpace. They may try to groom them by being 14 and 15, but they will let you know that they're 40 by the time you meet them. Still, the kids who sort of get pulled out into this are not in great shape. What ends up happening for most teens that I talk to, which is great, is it was great when I had this 14-year-old girl come to me. She goes, "Is this predator stuff real?" I'm like, "Well, you tell me." And I'm like, "Have you ever gotten a message from an older guy?" She's like, "Yeah, you delete that shit." I'm like, "Right. Good answer. We like that. Those are your predators." And they're like, "Oh, why would anybody respond?" So for the majority of teens, it's actually completely foreign to respond to the adults in general, let alone the teens that are not going to give them some sort of validation in school. So the kids who are more at risk to even respond to the teens that are different than them are the ones who don't actually have a deep ingrained social world at school. So that's important. And one of the things that I've been trying to work with MySpace is actually how to do network analysis to see the kids who are most at risk. So that one of the things that we're trying to figure out how to do is how to do social work online. We do this all the time offline. How do you do it online? And because there are kids who are at risk, and it would be great to reach out to them. Unfortunately, the press has hyped things up in a whole different perspective. Almost every case you've read about has turned out to be not true. And that's really scary. It drives me out of my mind. My favorite of which was the case of the two Alexes. Two girls living on, outside of Los Angeles who magically disappeared. Their parents screamed foul, say that they were abducted. Mind you, it's important to note that there are 300,000 abductions per year in the United States on average. Over 70% of them are non-custodial parents. Of the remaining, almost all are people known to the family, and they average about 12 to 15 a year that are strangers, and those are the ones that are unsolved. So we don't even know that they really are strangers. So stranger abduction is rare to begin with. So these two girls disappear. They disappear in some ways in telltale signs of being abducted. They didn't take their wallets. They didn't take their medication. They didn't take anything. They didn't take their favorite purse. Parents screamed foul, threw it up to the police. The police turned it into a press report. MySpace responded by calling up the police. We're like, "Oh, we see this. How can we help you?" And they're like, "Will you look into the accounts of these girls?" We can talk about the privacy issues later, but they decided to do so. Figured out the girls had stopped logging in 8 days prior to being abducted, and managed to start logging in the day they were abducted. Again, logging in from computers in downtown Los Angeles. Surf around through these girls' profiles, figure out that actually they were probably lovers. They'd been sending messages back and forth to one another. They had written deep love letters to one another, and it was not clear that their parents were so approving. So they sat there and go, probably run away, and they gave the police a lot of IP information to help them track them. Found the two girls. Interestingly, the day that the parents were to appear on ABC, some big TV show, both had run away, and they didn't want to go home. Forcibly brought back. The press never corrected it. So I just warn you, when you read about some of what's going on, most of it's not true, and which is unfortunate because the incidents that are true are a big deal. And there is some terrible stuff online, don't get me wrong. The question is it more dangerous than offline? Actually, the stats say no. You're far more at risk going to school than you are going on MySpace. But the school is seen as supposedly a protective space that we want to give our kids. And of course, the most dangerous place for the average teenager statistically is your own home. And that's because of, unfortunately, step-parents and uncles who are the primary abusers, statistically. But of course, we see that as a controlled space, and we see the risk of the offline space as being so much more greater, or the online space as being so much more greater. But so one of my desperate desires is, can we actually work on solving abuse cases? I would like to focus our attention there. The other sad part about police, I have worked with FBI on a regular basis to report everything from child porn to predator stuff. They don't have the resources to actually prosecute it. So even when you notify them, they don't have the resources to do it. But they will try to create laws to actually stop all these sites from existing. I would also like to see our energy put towards actually giving police officers the resources to do something when cases are reported. And so, sort of a lost, confusing thing. So if any of you work in local politics, that's one of the places you want to get at. You want to give them resources to actually investigate and do something about this. At this point, MySpace is actually much more riskier for child predators than they are for children, because police officers at every town are pretending to be 14 and 15-year-old girls, and they're doing an amazing job of, seeking sex from older men and finding all of the idiots who actually get lured in by this, which I think is interesting in and of itself. Other questions? Yeah?
Do you see homeless teenagers using MySpace to create community?
Yes. So the question is, do I see homeless teens using MySpace?
You're talking about that physical community and then things we don't have.
Yeah, well, actually, they do have. They actually probably have more of an impressive physical community than most teens. It's really interesting. I'm going to sort of back up and say who's using MySpace in America. It is an amazing, mind you, things are fragmenting, so I will sort of put that, who was using MySpace. It is across all class dynamics, it is across all race dynamics, it is across gender, it is across everything you can see, with one exception: rural teens. Rural working class teens. And the reason why is that rural working class teens, their primary access to technology is through schools and libraries, most of which have done a really good job of already self-banning most of these sites. So they've been written out of this cultural phenomenon, from day one. Urban working class, poor, and homeless kids have amazing access to it, mostly because of rocking librarians. So librarians in sort of the big city libraries have fought tooth and nails to make certain that anybody can log into these sites. And they in particular are an amazing resource for homeless teens. And you will see this, I certainly see this on the West Coast, and I've certainly seen this in New York and Boston. I don't know much down here. The libraries are the primary place where the kids will go and they will hang out, and it becomes a place of conversation. The other place where you start to see a lot of that is the different kinds of shelters that have popped up for teens. There are cities that are more heavily populated by homeless teens than others, runaway teens. Seattle and San Francisco and Portland are really big, and they have amazing systems set up to actually help those teens. The exception for the homeless teens are those who have hardcore drug problems, the heroin problems particularly. Those kids are not using the online worlds, but for a lot of the other homeless teens, they're using it to converse and to actually build out networks to travel. You will see a whole traveling band of teens. They will travel. I've learned so much about how to hop on trains from these kids. I love them. And they do. They hop around. They use it to figure out where they can stay, because a lot of the homeless teens actually stay with people. They're not actually staying in shelters. So they'll figure out, who's sort of good folk to stay with, and they will go in bands of 4 to 7 to do so. And so they've built a lot of community, and they use the technology to do so. They use email. Homeless populations in general have been amazing adopters of new technologies, new social technologies. When there was a study done in San Francisco, this was a little while back when mobile phones were not nearly as common as they are today. They found that homeless populations were 2 times as likely to actually have mobile phones. And the reason is that if you gave a shelter number to a potential employer, you weren't going to get called back. If you gave a cell phone number and just did the paper minute or paper call, you would get these phone calls back and you could answer them and you could secure jobs. And so for the working homeless in San Francisco, the mobile phone was essential. And it was quickly picked up all over the place. And then there was all this question of, do we directly support it? San Francisco, mind you, having major drama around the homeless issue. So homeless populations have used these technologies continuously. There's some great blogs out there by, this is less teenagers, more 20-something homeless guys, and it is mostly guys. Will create full digital worlds and sort of build out communities. But there's no doubt that you're seeing it, at least in the urban regions. I don't know anything about homeless populations outside of the urban regions, though. So that's still a big question mark.
I have one more question.
Sure.
I study young adults in the library world.
Nice.
You talked about them being in a controlled environment today. Patricia Hirsch's idea of a tribe apart and the whole notion that they're not supported. Maybe you're using the word controlled, but I'm wondering about the difference that you see between being in a controlled environment and being in a supportive adult, an environment where adults are supportive.
Right. So when I'm talking about control, I'm talking a lot about mobility and physical access, and some of which the control is structural. In very few places in this country we actually have public transit, which means that you're trapped into literal restrictions based on mobility. Some of it is control based on you will be in this home at this time, period. So pure out curfews. Some of it is, some of what we grew up with, being the latchkey kids, which was, go home, stay home, which we never did, but now is a lot more regulated. So there's a lot of these controls. The other thing is, of course, the rise in after-school events and these kind of things. In terms of supportive, and what I know of Patricia Hirsch's work, which I have not actually read, is that a lot of it's about sort of emotional and the other aspects. We have an exhausted population, adult population, particularly in middle and upper class society. We're exhausted. We're working ridiculous numbers of hours. We are, both parents are working. We are living in a culture of fear where I love going into an airport. It's like code orange. Like the amount of fear that you have, just the tiredness that the population is. And I see that at home, in the homes all the time. And
what I'm thinking is it the control that's driving them to create these online worlds and community, or is it the lack of adults and other people being there for them? I mean, I see
and I'm sure it's entwined. Yeah, and I'm sure you're right. I'm sure it's very entwined. It's interesting because the one population that I've seen actually have both the support and the freedom is actually more, working class, rural, urban communities, because parents sit out, adults sit out on the stoop, whatever the equivalent is, the stoop is, in that particular area, and they sit there and they know whose kids are going around, and they're conversations, and part of it is the value of just hanging out in the public space, because it's not just a matter of exhaustion. It's I get into these painful. One of the fun things about going into a homes is you get to see sort of some of these structures, and the television isn't just the babysitter for the kids; it's the babysitter for the parents. They're just like relief. So a lot of that supportive issue is all of these dynamics. But when I think of it, like the control is also, so many of those kids, they don't see their parents until 7 o'clock at night. They don't see their parents for the whole day. They've got activities out the wazoo on the weekends. So all with the best interest. And that's one thing that I sort of, complain about some of the situations with parents. The parents really mean well. They want to give their kids the best leg up. But that doesn't necessarily mean society has created a situation where they can do so effectively. And nobody, we don't get hand guides to be parents. Nobody really knows how to deal with depression or where it's coming from or what's going on or how to communicate with their kids. It's not really a community situation anymore at all. It's so, narrowed into just the single family unit. And so there's a lot of just confusion. And I think you're dead right that it's them all working together. The control and the deep desire for the kids to get control is definitely correlated with the harm, because it is a process of seeking control. But I'm worried. It was weird spending so much time with teens. I started to be like, I don't want to have kids. Like, am I going to even be able to raise them? I don't know. Around here, because it's really hard. I'll leave it there. Yeah.
So what you're talking about with those communities where where there is support, there's sort of a panopticon that's going on there. That even if they aren't seeing their kids every second of the day, they know their neighbor from 2 doors down, and they know that that neighbor will report to them
when things are very bad. That's actually the assumption, is that people won't report just anything, because there's the assumption that kids will be kids, and if it's not your own kid, you understand it.
It's whatever the norm is in the community, and that's also a lot of the way that these online communities work, where people are behaving to a norm, but adults don't. I think part of it, what's going on is that adults don't realize that that's also the way that, because they don't participate in online communities. Right. They don't realize that kids are behaving in a norm-based environment even when they're online.
Right.
Do you think that if and when more of the adult population is actually involved in online social networking, that would change? Well,
it's not just. I don't think anybody's ever gotten what teens do. It's amazing. We all went through it, and yet we still don't remember it. Like, my favorite, of course, is the drinking. How many people managed to get to 21 without having a glass of alcohol in this room? Unfortunately, it's not really realistic. The stats have been showing us that 85% of kids have had alcohol before they drink, and there's a lot of posing that goes with that. The posturing, it doesn't matter what generation. Do you have to leave the house wearing that? Right, like there are cycles of this. We've seen this over and over again. But whatever that is just shocking to the current state of adult views on things. So I think that it's not just a matter of lack of familiarity with the systems, but our constant lack of understanding with generations behind us. And parents who do get that, which are usually called the cool parents, they're doing quite well both online and offline. And I had a really funny conversation with a father who had a 16-year-old daughter, and the daughter invited him to join her on MySpace. When he was like, okay, I'm going to do this, right? Like, goes online, and she's filled out one of those quizzes. And for anybody who's been on it, there are lots and lots of quizzes, where the quiz was, what drug are you? And she'd come up as cocaine. And Dad is sitting here going, okay, what is this? So, rather than flipping out, he goes, so, daughter, what is this? And she's like, well, it's like one of those quizzes, where you know what your options are as the answer, so you kind of fix the answer so you get what you want. And, well, the kids who do pot at school are just, they're lame. They don't do any school. They do nothing. And alcohol, come on, that's everybody. And, and I don't want to be a hippie, but, people seem to do a lot of work on cocaine, so I thought it would be a good representative. I mean, that's what your generation did, right? And you had this really funny conversation back when Dad's like, yeah, I don't even know where to go with that, right? Like, he's like, okay, we'll just leave that it goes and just, roll with it. And so there's part of it is about asking the questions rather than trying to judge, and the sort of tension that goes back and forth. A lot of the cool parents, I mean, it's amazing. You'll see parents on MySpace that have connected to all of their kids' friends and like, yo, Mrs. D, you're rocking, you're here, and you're just like, all right, that's fantastic. And part of it is that, I love this one mom's page. It's like filled with Rocky Horror Picture Show stuff, and you're just like, okay, it's like, and her hair, it's amazing. She's got the full 80s look. I was like, great. And they just they have this funny banter of just on the comment section with the mom. So there are parents that are present, and in many ways, I actually think it's really cool when those parents are present. And I've talked to some of those parents, and they will write out to the kids' parents being like, hey, I don't think your mom's gonna appreciate that picture. Just in case she figures it out, you might want to put it away. So, it's interesting to watch how these cool parents, just like the cool folks in the street, will kind of give you advice of how to make certain you don't get into too much trouble with your parents, will let you be kids to a certain degree, but be like, yo, this is really not going to fly. So I think that there's this balance, and that's where I go back to a lot of notions of social work and policing and whatnot online. Police officers are not just meant to be scary creatures, that go and arrest people. They do actually hang out and make certain things are okay. And they do that. I mean, I love watching school let out down the street from me. there are always police officers just hanging around. You know, they're not looking for the kid who's going to throw trash on the street. You know, walking out of any class at the end of the day, there's litter everywhere. They're not going after the minor things. They're just making sure things are okay. And they're trying to be some sort of representative there. Same with social workers. Same with people who do, you know, teen outreach. And so a lot of my question is like, how do you get those adults involved so that it's not just going in and trying to surveil your own kid, which will inevitably give you a heart attack all of the time. Because no matter what, when it's your own progeny, you're like, yikes, what are you doing? And so it takes a little bit of breathing before you can actually cope. Yeah?
With 100 million people on MySpace, or 110 million, or whatever it is, it's obvious that there's a wide swath of the population. And in that swath are many different subcultures. You know, if you want to put sort of two opposing ones, you could maybe say the conservative kids from suburbia, and you know, kids from inner city, that sort of thing. And then there's many of different types of cultures that are going on in this service. And so the question I'm wondering is, if you're not hanging out just with that culture when you're online, when you're connecting to people in your school, that sort of stuff. Are cultures observable, and are there boundaries, and are those boundaries observable?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that I'm painting really huge broad strokes, which is sort of a danger of giving a talk about something so huge. There are, you know, it's interesting to watch the boundaries that get formed, because a lot of it is what they see as their boundaries, what they see as their norms, and how you are expected to put up your profile accordingly. And this is all under the guise that there is one context, the context of your friends, right? So if the norm with your social friends is that you damn well better be putting your girlfriend or boyfriend arm in arm on that photo, guess what? They all do it, right? And damn straight, that's also the person that's in your upper left of your top 8. So there are these norms that get written out by the entire group, and you read it in the comments when people break the norms, right? Whatever the norms are for that particular group, they'll sit there and discuss them. Religion is actually a really interesting one online. It is a huge part of the conversations in certain groups on MySpace, and there's a lot of boundary negotiation around what that religious group seems to think, or what the youth of that religious community seems to think are the appropriate ways to present yourself. Interesting enough, if you want to see an absolutely fascinating social network site around religion, I strongly recommend looking at Battle Cry. Battle Cry is hands down the strongest regulator of norms of any social network site I've ever seen. It is created by Jerry Falwell. And it is created by Jerry Falwell to raise the next generation that will replace him. And status games that you've never seen. So it takes religion to a particular extreme. But there are a lot of groups in there, of what kind of music is accepted, and you can see it. And you see the kids who are trying to bridge groups, and they're trying to be very careful about it. And bridges are always difficult. The bridging problem was actually far more noticeable on Friendster than it ever is on MySpace, and part of it has to do with who that population was. If you look at new social technologies, there are 3 populations who are usually early adopters: geeks, freaks, and queers. Right, self-identified. It was Usenet, it was email, it was chat rooms. It's amazing that these populations, very self-identified, will go onto there. It was the beginning of OneList and e-groups, etc. In the first round of Friendster, those three groups were gay men mostly living in New York, bloggers, actually an interesting stronghold of UK bloggers, but bloggers in general, and Burning Man attendees. For those who aren't familiar with Burning Man, which I always get in trouble for not explaining that, Burning Man is an arts festival that takes place in the middle of Nevada on Labor Day weekend, where people run around naked, create lots of faux fur, create tons of big art, and burn it down. It's an amazing community of people trying to have a very utopian communist structure.
7,000 people.
Oh no, it's actually 40,000 this year.
40,000.
Burning Man was 40,000 last 2 weeks ago. I strongly encourage you to take a look at it online. It's kind of entertaining. So anyhow, these populations, this mostly actually being a San Francisco culture. It was originally a San Francisco event. It has grown way beyond Ocean Beach could handle it. It has moved to Nevada. So these populations joined it, each thinking that they were the only population on Friendster. And so it's great. You get these conversations from gay men talking about how great it was that there was a new gay dating site that was free. And you're like, okay, I'm going to worry about you. You're going to be in trouble very shortly. The Burning Man attendees were so stoked that somebody was there to support all of their goofiness around Burning Man, which included a lot of fake presentations. Because one of the rules of Burning Man is that you create a playa name. A playa name is sort of a nickname that you use there to sort of hide your identity in everyday meet space. And so you go there and you goof around and you talk about yourself as Star Child or whatever. And so most of the people who created Burning Man contingent structured profiles there used their playa names. And they would create all sorts of fake bits. Well, it wasn't too long into it that people created a Burning Man fakester to begin with. Right? So the Burning Man fakester was the idea of collecting all of the people online that attended Burning Man and sort of make this a real prominent thing. Burning Man the fakester ended up having over 10,000 friends. Yeah. Became very visible to everyone on the site. Started making everybody go, there are different populations on here. And then another group started creating a competing, namely the bloggers, started creating a competing fakester, Ali G, who's kind of a humorist out of the UK. So the two competed, and Friendster went, yeah, right, you're going to control the site, and killed the profiles. And started, amazing efforts to control everything that would go on the site because this was to be a proper dating site. But people were having a field day by that point. My favorite of fakesters were this fakester named Salt and a fakester named Pepper, who used to have these crazy conversations back and forth in their comments or their testimonials about who was better on what foods and when they blended well, right? You just see these recipes building up, and it was entertaining. And so it became a little treasure hunt. You'd run around trying to find the fake profiles that would entertain you of all different forms. The site's creators decided this was inappropriate and started what was deemed later as the fakester genocide. Where a bunch of people created a fakester manifesto and actually came with little signs and protested every time the founder of Friendster would come and speak, which was pretty entertaining. I used to love to go to those protests. They were fun. Just to watch all of the goofy people. You realize they didn't look anything like you would expect. But as this was sort of growing, different populations were coming online. Mind you, the first press for Friendster was in June. The site June of 2003. The site launched in July of 2002. People really started joining it around February of 2003, and by the time it hit June, it had 300,000 users. So people had really had this expectation that it was not just a flood of random folks, it was really the friends of a friends of a friends. So they controlled their profile depending on what they saw their friends' profiles looking like. So if you joined because you were part of a Burning Man community, it didn't matter that you also had a professional life. You saw all the burners, you created up half-naked pictures, and then your boss showed up. That did not go over well, even in San Francisco. And one of my favorite incidents was a young woman, 28-year-old school teacher. She had joined with a lot of her Burning Man friends, and her profile was actually pretty simple. It had a picture of her wearing fat pants, standing on a hill, and talked about random music she liked. Didn't even actually talk about Burning Man, didn't really say much. The site was supposedly 18+. One day she walked into school in the middle of September, and her student said, "Why do you do drugs and why are your friends pedophiles?" What? And they made references to Friendster. She went and logged in and started surfing and figuring out what they said. Almost all of her friends had references to Burning Man, some to drugs, so the assumption, guilt through association. And one of her friends, a male, also about her age, was dressed up in a Catholic school girl uniform, clearly a costuming adventure, with his friends writing tons of testimonials about how he liked small girls. Clearly a joke between the friends. This was not read the same way to the young students. And the teacher faced a really difficult situation. Does she delete her profile? If she deletes it, she's assumed to be guilty of everything they've accused her. Does she unfriend those people? That doesn't make sense. Can she tell her friends to change it? what context is she operating in? Instead, she decided to play ostrich and pretend like it didn't exist and stop logging in and otherwise ignore it and hope it would go away. About a month and a half after that, one of her fellow teachers was fired for similar situations. All over the place, I saw people creating fakesters actually as an attempt to hide the context collapse problem. Young professors who, didn't really want to reveal to their students that they were on there with their friends. Do that wouldn't go over so well. People trying to just deal with these multiple contexts. And adults actually are faced with that in a much more uncomfortable setting than young people, because young people are like, I will be myself. Young professionals are like, eek, what do I do? And it's a huge discomfort. This, of course, is nothing new for online worlds, and search has actually been the damage of this consistently. When Deja News launched in 1995, 96, people started searching for everybody they knew. It didn't take very long before a man was fired from his company because his company had done a search and found that he posted simultaneously to Complang Pearl and to alt-sex bondage. And they figured it would actually be bad for their reputation. I'm hearing over and over again, people are trying to write contracts for their employees to sign about how to represent themselves online. Right? Fears about how they might look badly because when people search for that company or those people, that there will be this bleeding through guilt of whatever you portray. There's a lot of this confusion of how to actually balance these contexts. Perhaps here's where I will bring in Facebook and the incident that happened last week that he wanted me to make sure I addressed. How many of you have Facebook since we're sitting in college land? All right, sweet. I'm sure you saw the newsfeed adventure last week where they decided to actually give you everything that goes in. It was amazing. I logged in and realized that my friends are on threesome groups. And I was like, yikes, I wasn't ready to see that. And I don't even want to talk about when my students were joining. I was sort of sitting there in a mixed context, and I was like, this is not going to go over well. And then he starts sending me notices. You want to read this? You're going to love this. And I did. It was great. And I started actually looking at it, thinking about notions of privacy and what it means to talk about privacy. In the tech world, I don't know how many of you have ever worked in a tech sector, privacy is a bit. Privacy is like, yes, it's private. No, it's not. It's there's no nuance. There's no clarification. And it's a bit for data. Data is private or not data. The reality of privacy and how most people experience it is like an emotional feeling. Do you feel private? Do you feel public? Where in between? And when there's a confusion in public, there's a feeling of ick. It's just like, ew, gross. And what the newsfeed did was sort of ring bells on that ick, where people were like, ooh, this is data that was already there. But there's a difference between being able to, go and find it. So it's like, if I want to stalk Fred and I sit there sitting every day updating and see what groups he joined, I can get that much data. I can probably also write a script to do that for me, but I'm not very likely to do so. That's creepy. So it's a question of like, who are you paying attention to what extent? And of course, there are people that are doing that. Breakups do amazing things to people's desire to stalk. But for the most part, we kind of let things go and we keep things loose about who we watch and what we pay attention to. But so what Facebook did in terms of privacy was like ring two different bells. One was exposure. When I joined this, threesome group, when I join that group, I don't necessarily want to announce it to everybody I've ever met. Maybe I'll announce it to the person I want to have a threesome with. I don't know. But I'm not going to announce it. If somebody finds it, I can sort of start to explain plausible deniability is a beautiful thing, sort of work my way around it. But announcing everything you do is a whole different dynamic. And the metaphor that I sort of used when I was writing about it online is you're sitting there, you're having a conversation, the music's really loud, you know that people might be able to overhear you if they're listening in. Again, that registers as creepy. And all of a sudden the music stops, and you make that mistake of screaming loudly. You're like, uh-oh. And part of why that's really weird in terms of this exposure is that you're exposing something that may or may not be actually problematic, but you're exposing it in a way that's a broadcast, decontextualized, extremely announcing style, and you have to deal with all of the different people who might hear you, whereas you can't go and couch what you're doing to all of them when they ask and the explanations that go on. People also do a lot of things that for socially appropriate face reasons, Gossip is a beautiful thing. We sit there trying to overhear whatever we can. It's fun. Does it mean it's healthy for us? No. Gossip often has a cost to it. So the example, again, learning from history, there was a brilliant piece AT&T did, a robot called Cobot. And I loved Cobot. Cobot appeared in Lambda Mu in a time where I'm not remembering the date of it. If you search for Cobot, you can find this. And Cobot was a little robot, a little research robot that any one of us in the room could have imagined building. And it went in and it was going to study all of the behavior in the Mu. And it sat there and it collected data and it collected data and it collected data. And after a while, people kind of gone, wow, this robot's collecting a lot of data, but it's not actually giving anything back. Can't you make it do something useful and make it be a participant in this community? It is a community, after all. And so they said, oh, okay. And they reprogrammed it so that you could ask it questions. And needless to say, the first questions people ask is like, who do I talk to the most? You find out that you talk to Bob the most. Next question you ask is, who does Bob talk to the most? Not me. Not cool. Right? Everybody started asking these social questions, realizing that their perception of the social world was not matching the data of it, reinterpreting the data to mean totally different things, because, even the classic example is, I don't talk to my mom. I talk to a lot of people at work more than I talk to my mom. It doesn't mean that people at work are more important, but we love to misinterpret any quantitative data that we're given. Explosion. And the entire Mu actually imploded. People ran away from it. It totally destroyed the community. And it destroyed it because it was information that people were really not prepared to deal with. They couldn't deal with the social ramifications of that because they were interpreting quantitative data to mean something totally different. So just because you have information doesn't mean you get the right interpretation from it. Another issue that's at play with that invasion is there are cognitive caps to how many people you can pay attention to. This is a classic Dunbar, gossip and grooming kind of thing, right? Like gossip and grooming meaning monkeys groom as a way of keeping up their social world, humans gossip. You gossip in order to sort of, keep up these social relationships, right? How you doing? How's your family? What's going on? There is a limit to how many people you can keep tabs on, like genuine tabs on. It doesn't mean that there's a limit across all of your lifespan, which is why technology companies do an amazingly stupid thing of always giving you a 150 cap. For example, AOL had 150 cap for many years because you couldn't possibly know more than 150 people. Misinterpretation of research. So when you're dealing with the number of people you can actually manage, there is a limit. So what happens is this flood of information, you want to actually, keep it up, you want to pay attention to it, but it takes a lot of your resources, it takes a lot of your ability to actually keep on social tabs. It's also not reciprocal, right? Just because I'm following Angelina Jolie obsessively does not mean she's following me, right? So even though I've put a lot of attention into keeping up with her life, doesn't mean she's going to be there and be supportive when I actually need her. The same thing true, happens to us at a different degree online, and part of it is that we follow people, but then we expect things from them, and so. People who have dealt with being a blogger that have had audiences of larger than 6 have unfortunately had to face this, right? People think that they know me because they read my blog. I feel really guilty about this. And then they beg and ask for favors, and I'm like, ah! And you try to fill it out, and then you get to the state that I'm at right now where you work 20 hours a day and you're not seeing the light of day and you have no friends. And it's like, oh God, right? Like, what is the limit in which you can actually deal with it? What's the breaking point? What are the social costs of having this information? Right? Not just the privacy costs, but what are the social costs of having this information? And for me, there's just a huge research question mark. I look at it and I say, the past research says that this is a problem. Is it? To what degree? What are the costs? And wait a minute. What is her? She's here, the woman who did or one of them, that did the research on how there's a decline in the number of close friends people have, right? Social networks, huh? She's Duke. Okay. Sorry. There's this interesting question when we have a decline in close friends. Is this related to what's going on with this? I don't know. So I just sort of raised a lot of those questions. But technologists are really good because they like to give you tons of information and see what the social costs are going to be. I wrote a really snarky, cranky, pissy article a few years back called Autistic Social Software. Which unfortunately, the way it's phrased ends up making it sound a little more problematic than it is. But when you work with autistic children, you teach them about the social world in a very formulaic way. You try to give them structures necessary to see and interpret social material. The funny thing is that we keep building social technologies that are the same kind of structures that we give to autistic children. Are you my friend, yes or no? Right? Like, nah, that's not really the nuance of how people deal with the world. So much of what we're seeing with a lot of these social technologies is that they're trying to push at these very formulaic ways of interacting. And the result is all sorts of confusion and chaos and disruption as people then try to reappropriate and actually build nuance into it. There's a ton of nuance in these sites, but all of the new features that people bring out don't necessarily support them. That's 10 minutes left. One more question. Yeah?
I observe behavior of adults in online forums, and what I've seen over and over again is a discourse that goes on about like this. It's not real. And the other side of the discourse is, yeah, it sure is. So what do you observe about kids in online forums, in online communities? Is that discourse also there?
The discourse is definitely there. Is it real? Is it not? I mean, there's this battle. One of the pieces I wrote is actually called "None of This Is Real," which is a comment from a fakester. Realness is this really fun. It's like truth, realness and truth. We love those terms, right? Like as academics. My view, of course, it's performance. 80% of women in online dating sites are above average good looking. 80% of men make above average money. So, what's real, what's truth, so much of it is about how we perceive ourselves in relation to another. My favorite is to read Craigslist housing ads. We'll ignore the Craigslist scandal of last week, for those who saw that. But Craigslist housing ads, I am a nice, quiet, clean, roommate. Live with me. Clean, nice, by what standard, in what terms, right? So we're always seeing ourselves in our relationship to the social milieu and trying to perform a perception of who we see ourselves as, and dealing with that, then, okay, I put this forward, you give me a scary look, and I back away and try to give something else, and it is situation dependent, and it is impression management at all points. Thank you, Goffman. And these ways in which that plays out online are very, very consistent. People self-deceive all the time, and they don't even often know it. So you get into this question of even if we can pinpoint a notion of real, it's not clear that that is meaningful to this because it's not clear that people understand themselves. Are there people who are, creating fraudulent situations? Of course, right? The number of scammers out there, right? They don't even have to be from Nigeria. They're everywhere. They're trying to scam you for identity. They're trying to scam you for money. They're trying to scam you for attention. What are trolls? Trolls desperately want attention. They want that feedback. They're the kid who's constantly getting in trouble in class, right? We see these patterns over and over again. Does that make them any more or less real? One of the things that's really important, I think, is why a lot of this goes back to the physical world. So much of it is about moving between the physical and digital, and that's what people are most comfortable with because they're using all of their different ways of interpreting realness by their own interpretive mechanisms, what matters to them. There's also, challenges of this. There's a coarseness that comes to it. This is research that I did back in chat rooms and whatnot. Age, sex, location, right? If I say to you 25 female Los Angeles, and you start conjuring up a picture of Britney Spears in the middle of the situation, everything you will interpret from them looks like Britney Spears, and this is Aronson's work, right? Everything that you take, all of the new data, you will try to build into this mental model that you have. To the point where it will cause you huge amounts of trouble. And it's one of the online dating problems always, because that model is often wrong. So it doesn't matter if we have coarse data or not, we build models out that often get us into trouble. They get us in trouble in terms of everyday space as well, right? First impressions, Right? Why do first impressions matter? Because we build models of people and we shove all new information into them. So it can be much more tricky online when you have different information or much more coarse information. And that also complicates the notion of realness, because people are then seen as false because they don't live up to our models, regardless of what they were trying to put out as truth. And the other thing is, there's just data that's just never going to be right. Like, if you ask a teenager how much money they make a year, right, they're going to say $250,000 and above. Always. I love it. Like, Friendster was really great at this. Friendster used to give out stats of the average age of its users. The minimum age was 18. So what did 17-year-olds do? They said they were 71. What did 16-year-olds do? They said they were 61 or 69, because 69 is a really favorite age at that point. So you had, all of a sudden, because of the number of teenagers who were saying they were 69, the entire age averaging looked like it was much higher. So Friendster was like, look, we're the perfect 30-something dating site. Not quite. So it's one of the places also where data lies, and when you do aggregate data for a lot of this stuff, if I were to look at MySpace, I would think Zimbabwe is doing quite well. Zimbabwe has a lot of users whose friends all seem to be from New Jersey and Idaho. But it's the last thing in the letter. Zimbabwe and Afghanistan, they're amazing. The two things people choose over and over again because they're the first and the last in the list of countries, right? Does that mean that the users are actually there? No. Do they actually think that they're trying to pretend to be there from there? No. So again, it's about learning how to interpret some of that information. Anybody who actually thinks they're from Zimbabwe, when they see that, has some impression management issues. I should close and stop, but thank you so much for your attention and for coming today. Thank you. I don't have to be anywhere. I have to leave at